Welcome to Hope and Heresy, Life on the Religious Left, where we wrestle with contemporary issues using history and theology as our guides.
Our task is to reclaim religion for everyday people who want to live meaningfully without letting arbitrary doctrine or oppressive religious practice prevent us from asking big questions about our complicated world. I'm Reverend Sarah Lindsay.
And I'm Reverend Peggy Clark, and we're Unitarian Universalist ministers broadcasting from Community Church of New York, here in New York City.
Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Sarah.
Good to see you again.
It's good to see you too in this post-Easter week.
I know, I'm always so tired. So last week we sort of ended saying we were going to do a part 2 on our Easter conversation. But as we've been talking about it, we've sort of realized that part 2 isn't really about Easter per se, right? It's about more the relationship between the divine and humans, right? So the Easter story has us talking about like what do humans owe to God, or what does like redemption look like? How does God make that happen? And in fact, there's lots of different ways that the relationship between humanity and divinity kind of plays out, right? And we've talked a little bit before about the ways that humans kind of, by definition, God is this unknown thing to us, or at least partially unknown. And so we have to talk about God in the ways that we have to talk, and that's kind of limiting sometimes, right? So we were thinking a little bit about this question of God as possessed of a gender, right? So especially in the Easter story with Jesus like front and center, there's a lot of like he this and he that, and Jesus as the form of redemption and this male body, and in stark contrast to his mother's very female body, right, that produces life and is the one that grieves. And sort of, so this question of like, how are we limiting the divine by sort of placing the divine into a gendered category, and especially to think about it as the world increasingly understands that gender is not these sort of this or that, right? Like, and that we have created these constructs for ourselves. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the different ways that we project out onto the divine some idea of the divine's like physical form and like masculinity or femininity, and what qualities that happens to carry. And yeah.
Which is, in some way a conversation that started, it started, thousands of years ago and has been happening in a variety of ways. But it started again, maybe with the feminists in the 70s, 80s, who were trying to break open images of God, and lots of books coming out of God as mother. And yet now we again have this opportunity to rethink, because we're rethinking gender, and we're shifting out of this binary understanding, which in a lot of ways really frees God to be more godlike, right? I remember studying, feminist theology a long time ago, and making the shift from the assumption of maleness into an assumption of femaleness, and thinking really God isn't male or female. And I remember writing in lots of notebooks, God is beyond the realm of opposites. We now understand that we don't actually live in a world that has just two, that we are not in fact opposing, we are not opposites, that there is this gender fluidity even in humanness, which really breaks open what the divine might be.
Yeah. So, but let's go back for a second, because I want to talk a little bit about the idea that God hasn't always been so perfectly gendered, right? That like something kind of happens, particularly with the codification in Christianity, right, of sort of the Catholic notions of which gospels go in, and like that when we sort of get institutionalization of Christianity, we kind of get this hardline institutionalization of gender as well. It's a little more complicated. There's definitely like some feminine divine stuff that happens with mystics, right, throughout the medieval period, things like that. But if you go back early enough, you get these like other kind of visions, right? Like I'm thinking about like the Gnostic Gospels, which we haven't talked about yet, I don't think at all in our podcast. But there's one in particular, and of course I'm going to forget which one it is, but it's like the concept there is that like um a god tries to like create the world but tries to do it on its own, and it's like this false creation that's like evil, and in fact there's like a god beyond the god that people know, and like wisdom in the form of like a feminine character is sort of involved in the whole thing, and like so it's just the story was much more complicated if you go back, right? And you were sharing about how some of the early, even the early scriptural Hebrew scriptural texts don't necessarily have God as he, right?
Right. Well, in Genesis, the Genesis, God is referred to as they. That um in the, I think it's Genesis chapter 2, where God is, they created them. It is, it's
Yeah.
absolutely, now interestingly, scholars have said, oh, that comes from the ancient tradition of not being monotheists, that in fact God wasn't singular. So God was many, and the gods created them. But then the story is rewritten for a monotheistic culture. So they use sort of they in this singular pronoun. And yet, even then, they wouldn't have imagined what they were trying to demonstrate was a non-binary God. And yet scripture has that built right into it. And then not long after that, I'm trying to think of when the Book of Wisdom was written. And the Book of Wisdom is canonical for the Catholics, but not Protestants, or not most Protestants. I think that there are a few, it's possible the Episcopalians have it. But Roman Catholics definitely have this Book of Wisdom, which is absolutely a female gendered God. In that case, it's still the female. But right, as we go through time, we shift, and the male becomes more dominant, and then becomes codified. Like by the time we get to Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, and they're like, exactly what is it that goes into this book,
Yeah.
then they were really leaning heavily on all the male imagery.
Well, and then along with that, right? What have we done? We've done like divine punishment or like retribution, right? Like we've done like there's certain qualities that then get sort of imparted onto God, and then God as male, and it sort of underscores the notion that maleness carries particular, right? So there's a funny almost cyclical thing of like, so we project certain ideas or behaviors or ways of being onto God, and then call that male, and that reinforces that male behaviors, because we have talked about how our vision of God impacts how we behave, or sort of what we think we're allowed to do. And if God is allowed to do the following things, right, like kill everyone, right, or like destroy the world a few times because he gets mad about stuff, like all of a sudden what we're doing is we're sort of validating a particular vision of maleness that involves anger and violence, and also when you move into the Christian scriptures, sacrifice, right? Like also there's sort of an interesting set of values that then get associated with not just maleness, but like the most powerful, the most
Right.
bestest form
Right.
of maleness, right?
Right. The all knowing, all present. Yeah.
Yeah.
All judging, all deciding. Yeah. It's everyone's fear of their abusive father.
Right. Right. And then it's when you go back even further, right? And you have traditions that don't have a single God, that have many gods to represent many different parts of living and existence. Often the flip side of values are embodied, at least back then, were embodied in feminine, right? So sort of like the nurturing springtime goddesses and the hearth goddesses and whatever, right? So it's not, I mean, I guess I'm saying I'm not suggesting that like European Christianity is responsible for gender binaries through time, right? Like they've existed. And it's really interesting to think about how trying to deconstruct those binaries impacts how we understand God. Um, And I told you a story a little bit ago about my oldest child who, goes to, like, we've talked about this, goes to like a really progressive school, right, where they're teaching them about like gender identity and the spectrums and all of these things. And one day we were listening to some pop song where it was Justin Bieber, right? Holy, 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 where Chance the Rapper starts rapping about God as a he, as a father. And my little Unitarian Universalist 9-year-old is like, why does everybody think God's a he? If they exist, I bet they're gender fluid. And I was like, my work is done. But like the point being that like when you start to deconstruct it, when you start to deconstruct gender, you got to deconstruct it for God too, right? Like God doesn't get to live in the binary if we're gonna, but
Right.
that's hard to unpack for people, right?
Well,
I think oh, go ahead.
because we make God in our own image. And whatever our limited ways of understanding ourselves are, we then limit our understanding of God. So as long as we understand human nature to be male or female, we understand God to be male or female, and then we pit those two ideas against each other rather than recognizing gender fluidity and the shifting back and forth in a variety of ways of expressing self. And once we understand that for ourselves, we can start to project that onto some divine being.
What I think is so interesting about this, right, is that like I totally agree with you, right? From a sociological point of view, um, even if something beyond us exists, right, the way that we are able to speak about the ineffable is by projection, right? Like, in other words, maybe some separate thing from me ontologically is real, but I can't know it in our current form. So I can't talk about it. So the only method I have to talk about it is by the things that I do know and to get as close as I can by approximation, right? And so we get this projection piece. But what's so fascinating to me, right, is that at least for the monotheistic traditions, the narrative is God created humans in the image of God's self, right? Like we did this like funny work at the beginning of these monotheistic religions to sort of say, like, don't get confused. We're not projecting onto God. God created us in God's image, and that justifies in some way our projection onto God of our human attributes and limitations, right? It's an interesting kind of like mind puzzle,
Well,
um
all right, a way of saying it to know ourselves is to know God. And I think then that's what we do with Jesus also. And we have this like very human manifestation, and then say, well, if we project God onto this human. Now, of course, I think Jesus was God insofar as we are all God, but we use then this very male, very human image to understand God. Right? And I know that in some Christian circles, then you start talking about Jesus as, I mean, we talk about Jesus as like eating and drinking and sometimes laughing and certainly dying, but like going to the bathroom, right? And then you go like, oh, like, don't want to, we don't want to talk about that. But that we, there is something incredibly human about Jesus, but also about our need for God to be just like us. And you're right. An important part of that is because we can't imagine outside of ourselves. We don't have the capacity. I mean, one of the proofs of the existence of God is that we can't imagine something greater. Like by definition, it is God is the greatest because we can't imagine anything greater. We are completely limited by our own ability to imagine, to create.
So that incarnation piece is really interesting, right? Like the humanity of Jesus, because for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the humanity of Jesus was not the thing, right? Like if you look at art historical sort of representations of Jesus, for the longest time, it was like muscly, heroic, like triumphant on the cross. And it's only around like the millennium, funny things happen in the millenniums. It's only around the millennium that people are like, human, like, and all of a sudden you're getting like sort of gaunt, blood pouring out everywhere, like these really human portrayals of Jesus. So this question of incarnation and how we relate to the idea of a God being in a human or at least sort of, understandable corporeal form is really interesting how it evolves over time, right? Because it wasn't always a thing, right? I think for the longest time, probably there was something in the the salvation piece was the piece that felt the most important. So the triumph, the like godliness, the like, right? And then something happens, and what people need or want or rediscover is the approachable humanity of Jesus, you know? Um,
Well, it happens in waves historically, right? I'm just thinking, so we have like 325 where this is really debated, and then 451 at the Council of Chalcedon, where it sort of solidified that Jesus was both human and divine. And then for like 500 years, there's this heavy emphasis on Jesus as God, largely because they want to make Jesus, um, they want to bring a God to people who had just lost all their Roman gods, and they wanted to be offering something. And then right around the millennium, but bringing God back down to be relatable.
yeah.
So Jesus then becomes far more human, and we see it in waves. Right? So we see God becoming more godlike, and then more human, like over and over in
Yeah.
history.
And it's, I mean, there's a really large context, right? And like, we're not going to do a class on medievalism right in this moment, but like there's a much larger context, right? There's different things happening in monastic movements and other sort of religious thinking around the time. There's literally like millennial cults and stuff that are happening, right? There's all sorts of things going on that help to sort of conspire to bring this sort of humanness to the fore. But I think what I think is something that I think about sometimes is Christianity is not the only one that has incarnated gods, right? Like it looks different in different traditions. Like Christianity has a very clear, like there was this one time of incarnation, this one instance, right? And it had a very particular purpose and whatever. But in other traditions, there's like in Hinduism, right? There's like frequent incarnations of gods into different creatures, not just into humans, right?
Mhm.
And so that question of how we bring God down, and I don't mean down in some value judgment way, I mean like literally like onto the earth. Like how do we bring God into and onto this place that we know, right? It's not unique to Christianity.
That's also where some of this gendered language comes in, because we start to um, project our own experience of the world onto God, and then it becomes this mirror bouncing back and forth, so that then tasks for individual people become godlike. I mean, in a very traditional Christian home, a conservative Christian home of say 100 years ago, you know, the man in the house, there was a man and a woman and there were children, and the man like played the role of God, right? And and then as we started shifting and breaking open some of that those gender expectations, and then understanding women as playing the role of God as the creator, as the mother, as the nurturer, and different ways of. So we do keep wanting to bring God into our experience, into the very human experience, and define ourselves according to whatever these projections are, and then projecting those things back onto ourselves to locate ourselves somehow in this larger divine context of the world, and how we define all of these relationships and the expectations around how we're supposed to behave with each other based on what we expect or assume God is.
So I think, okay, I'm having a thought and I want you to go with me on a little trip, okay? So here's the thing. So if if we play out this notion, right, of like God as reflection, there's something we titled last week divine process. And there is the way that our world has pushed forward, right? And I'm thinking about the development and incorporation into real sort of popular understanding of like therapy, psychotherapy, and the idea of becoming, right? And if we look at process theology, so, and I always get his name wrong, Alfred
Wait,
North Whitehead, right? Wait, Northhead? I never remember his name. What is it?
Whitehead. His last name is
Okay,
Whitehead.
Alfred
Yeah.
North Whitehead. So if we look at, or like Gordon Kaufman, right? If we look at those kinds of folks, and process theology, which is sort of the idea of the divine is continuously unfolding, right? Like whether you want to understand that as unfolding because as humans unfold and humans learn, we project in different ways. And so God by definition unfolds, right? Or if you want to understand it as God is a thing that is sort of in us, among us, and also separate from us and unfolding on God's own path, right? But the idea of becoming, right? If we stop looking at God as a static, boxable, like definable thing forever, and instead look at God as something that is its own process, their own process, right? Then the individual becoming, right? So the child that's growing and learning who it is and deciding what it wants to be in the world, and that's not a process that ends, right? Like it's not like once I hit 15, I've got it all sorted and I'm ready to go, right? That the human unfolding is a process. Then the reflection again, or the I'm made in the image of God, or God's made in my image, either way you go, God is God's self unfolding as well, becoming in a constant state of creation, recreation, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, and this is the evolutionary theory, right? The same way that all of life on the planet evolves and becomes more and more, how do I say it, that we work toward our own potential, all of life, that God is part of the creation. God is also working toward their own potential, unfolding into this life process, and is never static. God is not one thing for all time. God is always moving, always in this dynamic process of becoming more of God's self, the same way that we all are.
And at the risk of sort of engaging in sort of armchair psychology from that Psych 101 class in college, I think that what happens is that folks, it's scary to understand yourself as constantly becoming and never fully realize is actually quite terrifying, right? Like there's a comfort in being able to say like, I'm done now, right? Like I remember in divinity school, we used to call things like growth opportunities, right? And I remember one time a friend just being like, I don't want another fucking growth opportunity. I just want to stop. And I was like, I hear you. Like not everything has to be, right? And not everything has to be. But there is an element that's sort of like, maybe it's a little disheartening or maybe it's a little bit scary, even though it's also filled with potential to understand yourself as never like that self-actualization is not a thing, right? Like it's a thing out there that we never reach. It's like when you go half by half by half, that mathematical theory, you never get there if you're only ever going by half, right? Um, and that I think that's scary for folks, and legitimately so. And as a result, the idea of God as being that too, like that God isn't even a solid thing that you can kind of cling to as like real and defined and never changing, right? Like that introduces a level of uncertainty into life that I think is hard for people, right? It introduces a level of lack of control um, that is extremely challenging. Most of us like to control like to control stuff, right? We like to think we know what's going to happen or that we have some ability to force what's going to happen, right? And you and I, we believe in free will, right? I'm not saying like everything is just like blah, but um I do think that part of what appeals to folks about more fundamentalist traditions is the idea that there is a rock solid thing that is very black and white. There is nothing like it's very boxed in two different ways, right? And that's just it. And you can count on that thing, right? Um, and that
When
asking folks to understand a constant process of becoming, it's a challenge.
when my father was first diagnosed, he was diagnosed with cancer and he was given 4 weeks to live. And what I wanted was a God who was going to make it okay. I wanted a God I could pray to, and like if I someone who was absolutely in charge. And I remember saying to people that I was sorry that I believed in a God not yet, because I wanted a God right now. I wanted to believe that there was something somewhere that was going to make this better. And instead, we are all engaged in the process of becoming, and that life continues to unfold, and that God, but it would feel so good to know that there was some kind of benevolent being who was taking care of everything, but not, it just isn't my experience in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that, Darwin really opened this up for us unwittingly. But I think that when he said, when he noticed that the way that life happens is in a process, that it happens slowly over time, I think that it opened the possibility that no matter what it is we think we know in this particular slice of right now, like that the birds look the way that they look, right, that they were actually dinosaurs. That, that there's this process over time that moved them from what they were to what they are. And this, we are not stopped, that they become something else. And that in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years, you know, if in fact we don't kill the entire planet before then, that those birds, just by the way, those birds will be something else, and that God too is becoming something else.
It's a big ask though, because what I'm thinking about is, especially like watching my children, right? Watching children come into an awareness of both their finitude, right, and their mortality, but also their sort of grandness and power, right? And we talk, I don't know about you, but we talk about this all the time in my congregation, or at least I talk about it all the time, that like we are both sort of like the things that you do matter, right? Like your life matters, the ways that you behave in your life matter. Like you are a being of great power, probably more than you even understand. And at the same time, like you are a tiny speck and a tiny thing in like a huge, huge unknowable vastness of space and time, right? So it's this weird like holding together of both, I am so meaningless and insignificant, and to the people around me, to the world to my life, I am not meaningless and insignificant. But those are like holding those together, right, is a challenge too. Um, and so that sort of like the God not yet and the person not yet, but at the same time, you are right now and God is right now. Um, I really think that's like the central theological tension of viewing the long process, right? Is this sort of the it's so easy as humans to see ourselves as like just this, right? And it plays out a million different ways, right? How I what I do with my money, how I think about my children or the past or the future, or like how I treat the planet, right? Like all of that is predicated on my ability or lack of ability to understand myself in a much, much, much larger, longer history, right? If I can't see 5 generations from now or conceive of it, then I don't care what I do to the planet, because whatever, it's not me, right? So much is dependent on our cultivation. And I don't think we do this well. I don't think that Christianity and I don't think that Western culture do a good job of cultivating that big view of humanity and existence and evolution and process, right? That we're really good at like right here in this moment, here's what I need, or here's what, you know what I'm saying? But I think something's lost, you
I
know?
don't think we even do it well generation to generation. I mean, I remember preaching, I guess I was preaching on climate or something environmental, and afterwards a man came up to me, a baby boomer, who said, you know, he said, I want to apologize for my generation. He said, we honestly didn't know. He said it was really cool to be able to make new things and buy new things and have things that were disposable. And he said, we really, it never occurred to us that there was no such thing as a way. It was such an interesting moment for me, because I thought, while I wasn't holding him personally accountable, he was really right. And yet, it's so rare that a generation can look to the next generation, and really never 3 or 4 generations away, because we're just not alive long enough for it, to say, I created the mess that you're in. And whatever it is that you are living with, for good and bad, right? There are also really good things, like we built that railroad, so you're welcome. But like that kind of thing, we're not usually around for it. And evolution, of course, is about millennia, many millennia, if there's, we need a word for that. um that there's no way for us to be responsible, to feel attached, to understand how things are really changing. I was just listening to the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which, by the way, the book itself is phenomenal, but to listen to it, to hear the author reading her own story to you is just a powerful experience. But she was telling the story of these two maple trees that are by her house and that had been planted there about 200 years before by a couple who were getting married. I guess people planted trees next to each other, and that here 200 years later she was now living under the, and that for their whole lives those two trees would never have gotten all that big. It took a really long time to be able to really, to have the shade, to have the maple syrup, all those things from the trees, and even that's just 200 years.
So yeah, so I do want to press a little bit though on the idea that like that humans are sort of definitionally not able to do this thing. I actually think it's partially a condition of modernity, right? Like, so if you go all the way back to like our first episode about like technology and stuff, it's only right, it's only in the last maybe couple hundred years where like lots of movement, right? It was not uncommon for people to live in multi-generational families, to not move from the town that they were born and grew up in and died in, right? Like people did live to see changes and hear stories and understand deeply the place that they existed in. And we've gotten really far away from that, right? Two things come to mind, right? So on Facebook, there was a meme going around about ancestors, right? And I never thought about this before, but I have two biological parents. They had two biological parents giving me four grandparents, and you have to keep going back, but all you have to do is go back like a couple hundred years and suddenly you're at like thousands and thousands and thousands of ancestors in a way that I'd like never conceived of, right? But we so sort of striate, is that the word I'm looking for, like ages in our culture and society, that we lose any sense of that like longevity, right? The other thing was a colleague asked folks just sort of randomly, like, how far do you live from the place you were born? And I was like, well, I'm like 2,500 feet as the crow flies, because I can literally like see it across the river. And he was like, shocked emoji face on Facebook. And I was like, I know this is not so normal now. And everyone else is like 2,000 miles, 3,000 miles. Like every once in a while, there's a 4-miler, right? But most of the answers are like just worlds away from where they were born, right? And so I think that there's something culturally, technologically, socially, where we have moved ourselves out of the structures that used to help mitigate generational loss, right? That there used to be ways. And it's true with religion too, right? When we get people moving out of institutionalized religion for perfectly good reasons, but you lose some of that memory, right? Some of that storytelling and sharing and embedded sort of eternal truths that exist in and among the, other crappy stuff. But you lose sort of that, like, what is our relationship to each other? What is our relationship to God? What is our relationship to the earth that we share, right? You start to lose some of that stuff. Um,
So this conversation started with this idea of how humans project ourselves onto God and how we understand God in a non-binary, gender fluid way, and we've moved into something totally different, which actually I think is really cool and completely unexpected. But as we're coming to the end of the episode, I think we need to just bring it back around so that we're sort of putting a period at the end of the larger sentence, which is really to say that we that in order to understand God, we have to best understand ourselves. We have to best understand our own situations, and then we have to best understand ourselves in the context of a massive history that continues to change. That the human condition, what it means to be human, unfolds, and we understand it differently in each generation over the course of all of human history, which means we understand God differently, and we need God to be different things, so we project different things onto God, and God's self continues to evolve and unfold and become, so that the relationship between humans and the divine changes over time, and that we are in a particular moment where we're starting to understand, at the very least, the ways that we've projected gender onto the divine. And in a generation, this conversation will seem either trite, and just sort of obvious, or maybe, right, maybe it'll still be radical. Who knows?
Well, hopefully it won't be radical anymore. I do think it's interesting. And we, obviously our whole season this season is about the divine, right? And sort of lurking in the background, right, is the sort of specter of atheism. And I think that there's a really interesting thing that perhaps we'll sort of double around to again on another day. But this question of sort of what is the relationship between atheism and the progression of sort of society and thinking and culture, right? That like atheism sort of happens in a more widespread way in a particular time and place, probably for a reason, right? So that even the belief in no God is itself a cultural, social, projected sort of development, right, of how we talk about humanity and existence and what the world means. Which is why I always argue to people that even if you're an atheist, you have a theology. But that's like, we can leave that little controversial tidbit for next time.
I know that next week we're talking about the seasons and change, and after that this whole season for this podcast ends. But in season 4, I think we should talk a lot. I think we should focus on atheism, right? We should talk about some of these things, about how, because I think that, whatever, I have a lot to say about atheists.
That's like another little controversial tidbit being dropped before we end.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, we can.
But for now, we need to close this episode because it's going on.
You and I could just talk for days. Yeah, I do think this is really interesting, though. I'm glad that we kind of got around to some diverse things, because it does all center around this question of the relationship between the human and the divine.
It does.
So
it was really good talking to you.
You too. I'll see you next
week.
Bye.